Okay, I think now is a good time to start. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to AMGC Connect's webinar, Understanding Governance for Your Manufacturing Business, delivered in partnership with the Governance Institute of Australia. So today we'll be hearing from AMGC's Managing Director, Dr. Jens Gonneman, and our guest speaker, David Kelly. Before I hand over to Jens, I'll just take you through a little bit of the background about AMGC and our industry growth program offering. So AMGC is the peak body representing Australian manufacturers. We provide services and solutions on all things manufacturing to both industry and government. AMGC represents about 220,000 employees across the country with a network of 12,000 and a membership base of 4,400 companies. Our experience includes co-investment and management of government funds, providing support to manufacturers, hosting networking events, and most recently, our AMGC Connect service under the Industry Growth Program, which you're all members of and how you are joining us today. So I'll speak a little bit more about our program. Under our AMGC Connect offering, it can be broken down into three key areas. So we have our one-to-one services where you engage directly with someone from our team and receive advice tailored to you and your business, usually solving a direct problem you are facing in your business. We then have our one-to-few offerings where we are doing things like best practice tours, showcasing manufacturers in our network, and hosting small leadership roundtables. And then we have our one-to-many offerings, which is things like our webinar series and other self-led learning opportunities. So today's webinar is an offering in the one-to-many category. Before I pass over to Jens, I just want to remind everyone to ask any questions in the Q&A box, and then we will address these following the presentation. I think that's enough from me, so I'll pass to Jens and he can talk a bit more about the Governance Institute of Australia and introduce our speaker, David. So over to you, Jens.
Thank you very much. David Kelly is the speaker after me. So I'm bridging and keep it very short as well. Jens Gonneman, Advanced Manufacturing Growth Center for 10 years. And we have asked David Kelly from the Governance Institute of Australia to share a little bit about governance, his experience, risk management. And I'm particularly a big fan of the Governance Institute of Australia. There are other governance institutes, but not so much tailored for the industry structure in which we operate, the small and medium-sized companies. There are other institutes which target and have a courseware for ASX 50 and larger, but that's not us. So GIA is where I find the greatest value, hence our partnering. David Kelly, an expert who will be speaking right after me, and all I could get from him is that he's a keen gardener, and he assured me everything what he gardens is compliant. David Kelly, over to you. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks, Jens. Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to be walking through a pretty practical version of what governance is. I've been teaching corporate governance for the Governance Institute for, I'll say too long. It's been over 10 years. So I'm more than capable at answering any of your questions. But the way I've tried to frame today is to make this practical and to give examples and try to hit the key points as to where governance issues arise in manufacturing and how we see it playing out. So without any further ado, let me share my screen. I think that's come up. Okay. So today is about governance in manufacturing, but as I said, not an abstract overview of what governance is. What I'm trying to do here is talk about how governance actually shows up in operations, how it appears in decision-making, and how we see it panning out in outcomes. And in particular, the outcomes piece is where we find that it tends to break. So I'm not going to try to solve all the issues around corporate governance or take you through what we spend nigh on 3 months in the postgraduate course talking through. That's for another time. This is a more practical discussion and something that we can work through in terms of why governance matters, and again, where it tends to have some tendencies to break in a manufacturing sense. So to kick it off, let's start with the obvious question: what is governance? So there's a number of different ways of talking about governance, but in short, it's often described very formally. If you put, go into Google and have a look, you come out with these extremely long-winded versions as to what corporate governance is. My version of the truth is up on the slide at the moment. At its core, governance is a system by which organisations are directed and controlled, and it balances the needs of stakeholder interests so that it sustains trust and drives organisational performance. So to clarify, it's about how decisions get made, how they get challenged, and determining what happens afterwards. So you can think about formal structures, things like boards, oversight committees, independent challenge, etc. But in practice, governance is not about having a structure. It's defined how well those mechanisms actually operate in the day-to-day. Clarity in decision-making, accountability for outcomes, and confidence for the people who rely on the business. And we'll talk in a minute just around who those people might include. So governance is not compliance, just to make it clear. Yes, you can have large boards. Yes, you can have complicated frameworks. Yes, you can have heavy reporting. But at its core element, it's not something that needs to be onerous. It's not something that you think about adding later. I'll get to corporate governance at some point. It's something that you should have from the get-go, and you should scale it with your business. It's really about that clarity of decision-making, accountability for outcomes, and giving stakeholders confidence in the organisation. So an example of that is, how do your staff have confidence before they join your organisation that it's the right place to work? How do your creditors make sure that they're getting a return on their investment? They're likely to get a return on their investment before they actually part with their hard-earned cash. So this takes us to who's interested in governance. And as I said before, we often see governance coming to the fore in the news and in general conversation, usually when something goes wrong. Think about the Hayne Royal Commission, the various Royal Commissions into casinos, albeit Crown, Star, etc. These are the things where governance is promoted. And it's often where we see decisions getting tested, usually in retrospect. And it's when accountability is usually sought out. That's when stakeholders start to pay attention. And in manufacturing, when something goes wrong, it tends to be very visible very quickly. And the reason for that is that we fundamentally have what we call in governance an agency problem. It's actually a legal term. And that's where we have the ability for different levels of the ownership chart to screen information from the others. Now, put most, the obvious agency issue is when you're buying or selling a house. If you're the house owner and you're looking to sell, you employ a real estate agent to sell your house. You give complete discretion to that agent as to, how they present the home, how they answer questions, how they tell people about, what different elements are important, not important, etc. You give a lot of that decision-making capability on the spot to the real estate agent. The real estate agent then feeds you back how the open inspection, how the tour, whatever it may be, went. That agent has the ability to screen what information they give the customer, the prospective buyer, and they also have the ability to screen the information that goes back to you as the owner. So that's where we have this issue of agency in a real nutshell. And so governance exists to align the decision-making processes, so in other words, what the agent is trying to do, with those that bear the consequences, i.e. seller and the buyer. And we use two key lenses to help frame all of this. The first is transparency, and the other is accountability. And we'll unpack that in various ways, shapes, and forms in the next few minutes. But this isn't just about process. If corporate governance was just about having a process, it would be a compliance exercise, and everyone would score, beautifully on their governance assessments. There's actually a really important commercial angle to this. When you start looking at the evidence that exists, and there's a great review by PwC that going back a few years ago, investors will pay a higher valuation on companies where they see strong governance because it reduces uncertainty. And it reduces uncertainty by that organisation being transparent and for it being accountable for what it does and how it operates. So, by reducing uncertainty, companies with strong governance get stronger investor confidence in the expected return on investment. They've got a lower perceived risk of capital. In other words, any risk premium that they have to pay to a bank or to private equity. And on the flip side, the clarity and confidence that investors get, they are willing to pay for. So if there's one takeout of today that I really want you to take back into your organisations, is that good governance reduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is what impacts on price. So the question is not whether governance matters. We really should be looking at how does it pertain to manufacturing. On the deck here, we've got 4 things that your staff, your customers, your creditors, banks, suppliers are all concerned about. What's your ability to keep operating? What's your operational resilience look like? Can the organisation maintain supply? And that's both inbound and outbound. How does it go about adapting or adopting technology? And yes, we will touch on AI. No presentation these days without that. And how quickly can hindsight can it highlight and escalate issues in production, whether that be inbound, inline, or outbound? So these are not theoretical issues. They show up differently in every organisation, but they exist in every organisation. So the real value comes from working through how they actually look like in your business. I'm more than happy to do that at another time. So the 4 concepts up here are not just operational issues, they're core components of the governance framework. They examine how strategy, how risk and culture are actually executed within the organisation. And these are the points where governance tends to break down. So what we're going to do now is look at these 4 areas one by one and start to unpack the different approaches and the different ways that corporate governance might be able to assist. First and foremost, let's look at resilience. Let's face it, most organisations are not set up to keep operating when something breaks. They assume that any disruption will be manageable. In reality, it's often not. So when we have a failure, it's not just operational. When your production line stops, it's not just an issue for the line supervisor. At that time, you're affecting revenue, you're affecting delivery to customers, and moreover, to your creditors or future creditors, you're affecting their confidence in the business. So in manufacturing, the real concern for your stakeholders around operational resilience is looking at all kinds of different things that might impact on your ability to continue to operate. There are some obvious things. Failure of suppliers, shortages of components, cyber disruption in production systems, failures in automation, and of course, we all know about geopolitical supply chain shocks at the moment, given what's happening in the Middle East. But it's not just limited to today. These are things that happen on a regular basis. Cast your mind back to 2020 to 2022, the time of COVID. There were many manufacturers out there knowing that they were dependent on a single supplier for a component. But until that point, they hadn't worked through what would actually happen if there was an upstream supply disruption or still stoppage. As a result, we saw production being halted, not because the risk was unknown, but because the response wasn't ready. And when we fast forward to today, a whole 5 years later, the governance question to be asked is, have we actually learnt from our past experience? I'll let you ponder that as you consider what's happening around you at the moment. So how quickly can your organisation detect, respond and recover from disruption to your production system is the key point on this slide. It's not just determining whether or not you've got a risk. From a governance perspective, resilience is not about disruption itself. It's about how uncertainty impacts the organisation's ability to meet its objectives. So again, we come back to that notion of the stakeholder, whether they be inside or outside the organisation, and whether or not they've got confidence in the organisation's ability to keep operating. That's the key governance piece. So organisational resilience, a key area, as we're seeing play out today, for manufacturers to consider. That dovetails nicely into supply chain. How important is supply chain from a governance perspective in manufacturing? Supply chain, from a governance perspective, is a classic what we call resource dependency issue. Governance has to recognise that critical value sits outside the organisation, and your framework needs to consider that. And in terms of transparency and accountability, how well does that play through your organisation? Do you have the capacity to look at supply chain as no longer being an operational issue, remembering that it can affect revenue, continuity of revenue, delivery of commitments to customers, create reputational risk, as we mentioned before, and also regulatory exposure. That's why it's a governance issue. It's multifaceted and it impacts on the entire organisation in many different ways. Supply chain is often an area where most companies think that they understand their supply chain. The reality is that in practice, many only see the first layer, and the real exposure sits upstream. Now, I've been fortunate enough to work in manufacturing for quite a few years. I worked for General Motors Asia Pacific back in the early 2000s. Later, I worked for Cochlear more recently. And we've seen these kind of things track through in variety of different production environments, spanning throughout that span of production. When we look at what happened in automotive during COVID, we had really stable tier one suppliers But, and those of you who deal in this would know better than me, there were issues in the tier 2 supplier, particularly around the semiconductor piece and the availability of those. And we saw that impacting globally on automotive production. And what we actually saw was that shortage was so significant that the product itself, the car, was actually de-specced, if you recall. Production was de-specced so that cars could still be produced, just not with all the bells and whistles that we had beforehand. Things like, electronic IPs went back to instrument panels, went back to being analog, all those kind of things. So these production shocks can have, in supply chain, can have real impact on your ability to operate. But not everything comes as a shock. So if I think back to General Motors, some things that happen are really well known. They're announced in advance, and the organisation has an ability to manage the change. The issue then often comes down to how well the organisation disseminates information and how well it's absorbed into the and changes your processes. Now, the classic in GM was in 2001 when the US Patriot Act was announced. There were a number of different mechanisms that came to play for companies based in the US with regard to anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing compliance. And GM was caught up in that. GM, global manufacturing base, you would think that they would be all over it. What happened was the organisation, at a management level, the senior management level was cognizant, thought they had all the planning, but no one had thought to make sure that we looked at how well it impacted supply chain. And in certain countries, and Thailand's the one that I'm thinking of, there was a practice where there were cash facilitation payments made in order to move container boxes in and out of the port. Now, it should have occurred to those within GM that this was going to be a major change to that process. But the lack of coordination resulted in container boxes being stranded on the dock for 3 months, which impacted the 2 Thai plants and actually stopped production. So the exposure was always there, but it just wasn't visible at the governance level for those operating plants. So most organisations have a really good general sense of these risks, but typically what they haven't done is step back and work through them in a structured way. And that's where the real exposure sits. Now, on a similar vein, we can look at technology and how that plays out, which is particularly relevant at the moment. Adoption of new technologies, automation is nothing new to you guys, and AI, the flavour of the month, can be seen right throughout manufacturing. Robotics, machine learning, automation of the quality control systems, and indeed, predictive maintenance, for an obvious example. All these things create tremendous opportunity for your organisation. But who's accountable when the automated decision fails? How do you go about monitoring algorithmic decisions, whether or not they're in scope or out? And how does your control environment evolve as your technology evolves? So, common example in automatic quality systems often comes through in advanced manufacturing. And as I said, I've been lucky enough to work in a couple of those environments. There's lots of organisations, everyone from Domino's through to Cochlear, who rely on machine vision or indeed AI models to help detect defects. The issue is that over time, those models can drift or be recalibrated, and I'm sure you've seen this far more than I have. When defects start to slip through, or to some extent, worse still, when good product gets rejected, it can sometimes be unclear in the organisation as to who actually owns the decision logic. And that's where you see tiger teams and committees being formed in order to resolve an issue. The system is running, but no one fully understands how the decisions are being made. And the outcome of all this, you actually see quite regularly. You see it in product recalls. And just to kind of tell you that this is a real world example, in 2025 in Australia, we had just under 1,250 recalls. So as decisions are getting increasingly made by systems, we have naturally questions about transparency, accountability, and oversight. So the governance question, as I said before, is no longer, is the system working? But do we understand how it's making decisions so that we, being the management team, and indeed the board, how do they go about exercising oversight? And whilst I haven't talked to boards specifically in this presentation, I do want to highlight the value of boards, the opportunity, whether it's an advisory board or it's a supervisory board, the opportunity to bring in others from other industries to help guide your organisation and provide lessons learned from other industries, which may or may not be aligned with exactly what your business is doing, has numerous benefits to the stakeholders who we mentioned before in terms of ensuring accountability and driving transparency. And so when we have accountability which is unclear, governance will break down. And that's where the value of oversight and independent challenge of good governance practices becomes more and more critical. So if we have all these things in place, the question then is, what could stop production tomorrow? And the point I want to make here is that no amount of governance structure, no amount of governance process replaces culture. Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And the way that risk is managed in the organisation is not an abstract, it's not a framework. It's actually a set of behaviours that determine whether or not a risk is identified, it's challenged, or it's ignored. And what we see over history is that most process failures usually start small. There's a warning, or there's a manual workaround introduced, or there's a general concern. And the issue is not that the signal isn't there, that there's something wrong. It's that the signal doesn't get moved, it doesn't get escalated, or it gets delayed. And what we've seen over time is those small issues accumulate until something breaks. And that's when the response is often, well, we didn't see it coming. In those times, production gets stopped and customers are impacted. But in reality, the signal is always there. And that's why when we start looking at things like the old 280 management system, the Kanban system, all those types of things were introduced into manufacturing in a very, very, very different era in order to make sure that these things were being addressed in near real time. The systems, quality management processes, etc., have all evolved since then. The question is, has our approach to governance evolved with it? And to start thinking about how that plays out in practice at a very extreme end is the 737 MAX issue. Issues were raised within Seattle internally, the Boeing manufacturing plant in Seattle, but they didn't escalate in a way that changed decisions. Didn't escalate in a way that the board were able to challenge management's decision-making process and say, are we heading in the right direction? But we don't need something of that scale in order to see the same pattern. As I said before, In smaller industries, it's often a recurring defect, or it might be a safety concern, or a workaround that becomes normalised. The signals are there, folks. They just don't get expedited. So what does governance bring you in that case? A well-governed organisation creates a culture where operational concerns travel upward quickly, so they're expedited in near real time, if not real time. Safety and quality concerns, raising safety and quality concerns is rewarded, not punished. And the executive culture encourages people to seek and report bad news early. So how do we go about identifying things? How do we go about escalating things? And then, of course, we come back to responding in real time. And that brings us back to the continuity hurdle that we started at of these four particular areas. I've been going for far too long, so I'm going to open it up for questions. But before I do, today, just to reiterate, is about recognising where governance tends to break. The next step that we're going to work through in a few weeks' time is looking at what it looks like in your organisation and where the real risks and dependencies sit. And that's a more practical session. We'll work through the themes in more detail. But the reason why good governance is important, and you can see my contact details if you want to chat about this, it does three things. It improves decision making. And that's important if the organisation is going to achieve its goals. Not just now, but strategic goals, the 3, the 5, the 15-year goals. How does it reduce surprises? Not just on the production floor, but for your customers, for your suppliers, and for your financiers and your staff. How does it increase confidence that the organisation has a good future and is a good place to work, good place to invest, and a good place to buy from? So good governance addresses the concerns of investors, partners, and indeed your own leadership team and your staff. So strong governance, yes, it includes some structure. Yes, it has some oversight and challenge, but it only works if the mechanisms that we've talked about today operate effectively in practice. And as I said on the slide, strong governance doesn't slow a business down. It allows it to grow with clarity, confidence, and control. At that point, I'll leave it there. I'll throw it back to, I think I'm throwing it back to Amelia for questions and anything else.
Yeah, thank you, David, for that presentation. If anyone has any questions, please ask them in the Q&A box or the chat box. Yes, Jens.
Oh, I thought you were all so shy, so I have the first question. David, that was very interesting. Thank you. I, in particular, was reminded of one of my favorite Austrians, which is a lot to say from the German perspective, Peter Drucker, who has his views on management and leadership. And he once said, management is doing things right and leadership is doing the right things. But the governance applies as a foundation for both, doesn't it? Because you want to have correct processes and management. And you alluded to production and manufacturing processes, but you also want to have the right governance processes in place to supervise management. And you gave the Boeing example, which I found interesting. So management, leadership, and governance makes governance basically leadership tool as well. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, Jens, great point. And part of how, from a governance perspective, we approach these things is to make sure that we look at these elements not just in isolation. So, what often happens when we have these incidents is what we call the Swiss cheese moment, where all the holes kind of line up, and something goes straight through and gets missed. And a good governance process, a good governance framework, good governance practices actually look at making sure that you identify where the holes are. And if you can't close them off, then how do you monitor them? How do you make sure that the organisation is able to maintain supply, inbound and outbound, and all the other things that we talked about today? So it's about behaviours, to your point, and to Peter Drucker's point, and it's about making sure that that it's very clear from everyone on the factory floor through to the board, if you have one, or if not, the founder or the owner, as to where the issues are and how we're going about making sure that we're actually able to maintain delivery, give good return on investment, etc.
Perfect. We've had a question come through from Adam. So when AI and automation start making or influencing decisions on the factory floor, what governance mechanisms ensure those decisions remain explainable, audible, and accountable to humans?
Adam, that's a fabulous point. So there's a couple of things with AI. So AI is machine learning on steroids, for want of a better term. And it truly is a black box. When you've got code writing code, it's very difficult to kind of understand the initial setup might be one thing, but the evolution of it throughout the production system is another. And so it's important to have some governance processes in there where the human element is routinely reviewing, having oversight of what's happening in terms of those systems. And while you can't look at the zeros and ones and how they're lined up in the black box, you can look at the outputs and whether or not the outputs are looking, the old control chart thing, folks. Are they sitting within tolerance or not? And what you should start to see over time is an improvement of those control deviations. And if you're not, or if you're getting regular points that flick outside, then you've got a question around, particularly in the QMS, you've got a question around how well is this operating, and do we need to go back and look at making some adjustments to this? The adjustments in how to do it is actually relatively simple. What tends to happen in the decision-making process is that, and that's what I was alluding to in the deck, is that people often, and I think there's now an anti-chat GPT movement, so I was reading the other day, people often kind of put the question in, get the response back and go, happy days, that's right. And what we see is that whether it be issues in the way that the information is feeding or the way that the AI actually considers the information and produces the result, there are these things called hallucinations. And it's really important that the human component is involved in that to make sure that the hallucinations are identified and that corrective action can be taken to stop that going through the system. Adam, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'll keep my fingers crossed. If there's another follow-up, let me know.
We just have another question come through from Michael. I believe our governance is sound at our modest business size. I believe we can upgrade after we make a step change in business activity through higher sales. Do you agree?
Ooh, that's a great question. I guess it depends where you are. It depends where you are in the delivery cycle. Delivery cycle in the organisational maturity. Clearly, when you're at a startup and you're looking for growing growth, you're going to be far more risk tolerant, for want of a better term. You're going to have a far bigger risk appetite, albeit off a smaller base. What we tend to see over time as the organisational maturity improves is that there's a shift in risk appetite. There's a shift in how things happen. Similarly, what we tend to see is that governance needs to evolve in the same way. Now, my point in the slides was that if you haven't got governance processes in place now, as a startup, then you need to have a think about how do you grow sales? Because as I said before, if you're a startup and you're trying to push through extra sales, that's great. But you've still got to work with suppliers. You've still got to, unless you've got a business that doesn't employ people, you've still got to work with people and staff, and you've still got to produce something at the other end for your customers to a satisfactory outcome. And so I would argue that having governance at the start, albeit it's got to be fit for purpose, is a really important point in order to grow sales and in order to give, when you want to grow, when you want to make further investments, be able to demonstrate to your potential financiers that you've got it, you know what you're doing. Yeah, we've got these processes in place. We've got an advisory board of Jack, Jill, and George who are giving up their time in order to drive the organisation to the next level. All these different elements of a traditional governance approach actually give confidence for people, not just in the ability for the function for the production system now, but in the organisation to continue to deliver into the future.
Perfect. Thank you. We have a question from Brody. Do you want to take this one? Oh, sorry. Wrong question. I got confused with the names. We have a question from Brody. I'll read this out. For SMEs without a significant built-out leadership structure, what practices can be implemented to ensure accountability is taken by members within the team, for example, senior managers, in support of good governance?
Amelia, that's a great question. And Brody, thank you for this, because it actually goes to the heart of what we're talking about here, which is culture. So there's an old adage about tone at the top. And so your leadership team, whoever they may be, need to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. And frankly, if you're lucky enough to have an advisory board or a board that can help you do that, that's awesome. If not, you probably need to have a think, about how you chat with the owner or the founder as to how you go about driving that culture. Because, my examples were quite kind of broad in terms of component, the impacts of components on supply chain and production change. But when we start looking at who's accountable for it, if you haven't clearly defined who it sits with, then that is something that needs to be clarified. Now, this isn't a risk and compliance course, but my approach as a corporate risk officer and my advice is to look at nailing accountability within the leadership team. When they're having their senior leadership team meeting, let's say there's 8 people on it, plus the CEO, so you've got 9. When there's something that comes up and we're talking about QMS automation decisions and whether or not we're inside or outside tolerance, who's got their neck in the noose? Who talks to it? And if you've got an answer of, well, it's between Jack, Jill, and George, you've got an accountability issue, folks. You really do. There needs to be someone who owns this. And where I've been fortunate enough to work and we do this well, you find that there is clarity in decision making, because it's not, oh, is that the finance guy's call? It's like, no, the finance guy owns the P&L on the balance sheet. So if you've got an issue with profit and loss, he's the guy that makes the call. If he makes the wrong call, he makes the wrong call. But you've got clear accountability as to where it sits. And hopefully that answers it.
Alrighty, there's a question from Jeremy Barker regarding being a regulated industry and assuming that they have a good governance system. Where do you think the failure happened in Boeing? Was it that their governance system were overridden by the commercial desire to make sales of a new product? David, if you don't mind, I take that one because I was working for Airbus for 20 years and I have a bit of views on that one, sharing my screen. So that is an Airbus. And you can see the massive size of the engine. And the Boeing competitor 737 has the wings much lower. The landing gear is much lower. So they can't fix the engines under the wing. They had to put it in front of it. And that was the challenge. And that's a complex software system which keeps the plane stable so that a Boeing can also run these very big engines which otherwise would not fit under their wings. So the question was, and then David, please, you're the expert here. In my view, on the management side, their job is to sell planes and have a competitive product, which from the design of the 60s, where the engines were very long, they didn't. And the failure on leadership was not to challenge management and overemphasize commercial success over compliance. So these were the two issues. David, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's a very good summation, and I think what we've seen from regulators, particularly in Australia, is a general learning from looking at what happens overseas. And what you'll start to see now is that there's far more, rather than kind of going through and if there's a review conducted by a regulator, it doesn't just kind of stick with the usual kind of zeros and ones and tick the boxes type of stuff. They are really these days looking at culture. They are really trying to make sure, how do we make sure that this organisation, if there is an issue, something like this, that it's not revenue over safety, for example, or it's not revenue at all costs, and that's certainly an issue. When costs are continuing to ratchet as they are at the moment, everyone's looking to cut corners. Or reduced operating costs, I should say. How do you go about doing that without impacting the quality of your product?
Thank you. So we have a question from Mark. In a real factory environment, what's the most effective way you've seen to catch and correct AI hallucinations before they turn into bad operational decisions?
Mark, if I had the answer to that, I think I'd be a rich person. It's an evolving area, AI. The whole AI thing is. As I was saying before, human oversight of how the system is operating is really important. Humans have a way of connecting the dots, which is different to AI. AI connects dots brilliantly, as we've all seen, but occasionally 1 and 1 equals 11, not 2. And so that manual review, that human oversight of how it's working, whether that be daily, every minute, whatever it may be, needs to be determined by the organisation. But looking at that, highlighting where things are starting to go offline really comes down to human oversight and making sure that, simple things like talking to your customers, that they are actually included, in the feedback mechanism and looking at whether or not, particularly and I'm kind of thinking of QMS systems here, whether or not there's an error that's starting to creep in, because your customers will tell you when you've got a slight problem. So if you're doing something like something complex like cochlear implants or even something like those continuous glucose monitors that have become pretty trendy in the last few years, your customers will quickly tell you that if they've got a problem with the adhesive tape, if they've got a problem with the fact that in the cochlear implant that the external piece no longer fits with the new internal piece or whatever. Your customers, give you some great information. AI doesn't have access to that. Humans do. Humans can reach out to the customer and have the discussion and bring that back and triangulate whether or not there's an issue in the AI. That'd be my advice. I'm sure there's more nuance to that, but at a quick thumbnail sketch, that's my advice.
Sorry, I was on mute. Perfect. We have a few questions from Oliver. So first, which modern equivalents of Kanban would you recommend considering and applying?
Wow. Look, there's without knowing the business, it's kind of hard to really commentate. Suffice to say that when you start looking at your production method, there's issues that can occur inbound, and then there's stuff that can happen in line. If the inline piece, and this happens over time from what I've seen, when the inline piece is performing well, and the end output piece is compliant and of quality, what often happens is that the pieces that make up that QMS in the inline system tend to be accepted or taken for granted. And so the whole notion of Kanban needs to make sure that at each of the gates that you've got, the quality gates that exist in your QMS, that you've got points that can capture that data. If you've got to a point where you're confident that you no longer need that data, then that's where you need to start looking at whether or not your Kanban system is actually operating the way it was designed. Doesn't mean that it's broken. It might just need a change. And in terms of where you go with that, I'm more than happy to take that offline. But yeah, there's a number of different ways.
Yeah. And another question from Oliver. Are there some examples of manufacturing organizations with great governance that you recommend learning from, especially in biotech?
Biotech. Well, Oliver, I am, of course, going to say Cochlear, having worked there. Look, I think in general, when you start looking at the large players, Cochlear, CSL, etc., their governance practices are probably second to none. The question is, and I was trying to highlight this in the deck. The question is, do we need all that stuff? And depending on where you are on that maturity curve, the answer might be, I don't need a board of 15. I don't need a whole lot of this stuff. But what I do need, being in a startup phase, is that I need someone to give me advice on marketing. I need someone to give me advice on finance or whatever it may be. Finance tends to be a bit more internal, but whatever it may be, in the next phase of development, on that maturity curve, you need to look to what your peers and your benchmark is, on that next level, and look to what do you adapt and what do you adopt. It's not feasible, nor is it in any way, shape, or form advisable to start looking at an ASX 50 company like CSL and Cochlear and starting to say, yeah, we're going to start putting in an EAS or something to do with sustainability or whatever it may be. These are things that need to evolve. Those practices and that awareness needs to evolve as the organisation evolves. Trying to put too much governance at the start, governance process, governance frameworks, etc., can hinder the organisation's ability to deploy its capital effectively. And that's what investors are really interested in. So you need to make sure that you can demonstrate to your investors, to your suppliers, to your staff, we know where the money's coming from, we know how we're spending our money, we know what we're getting in terms of pricing, and this is how we're managing all of it. Those things, they're fundamental elements, whether you're sitting in Cochlear or you're sitting in a startup.
If I may, I found one book very helpful for me to understand top-notch industries and how they manage risk. And if I quickly share my screen, driving Emilia to drink here. It's called Black Box Thinking. David, I don't know if you know that book, but it's comparing aviation and the medical sector with each other and their practices of how they manage risk. And I thought it's a cracker of a book, Black Box Thinking. The medical sector looks very bad and the aviation sector looks very good in their practice. And I thought you can learn a lot from that type of thinking. And I think relates to the question from Oliver. David, back to you. You're on the grill here for being a question, but I thought I learned a lot from that book.
Yeah, and Jens, to your point, that's exactly right. And that's not about, folks, that you need to go and buy Jens's book. Hopefully you get a commission, Jens. That you need to go and buy the book and study it and learn it to write. It's about who can I reach out to outside the organisation to give me that knowledge, to give me that help. And it may be that you engage a consultant, or it may be that you've got an ongoing need, and that's where you start looking at bringing in either a board of people formally or an informal advisory board to help give you that experience and say, you know what, I used to work for Toll, or I still work for Toll, and when it comes to those supply chain issues, this is how we get around it. That kind of stuff evolves over time within those industries, and by being able to tap it, your business is going to be faster on the foot.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question. Are there any governance templates available for startups? Where to see and get them?
That's probably a good segue across to Belinda, because I'm sure that we've got Governance Institute has lots of things. If not, feel free to reach out to me, David Kelly at Big Pond. I'll be able to help you out with something, I'm sure.
Perfect. Yes, I will pass to Belinda. She just wanted to say a final few words from the Governance Institute.
Yes, thank you so much. And templates, we do have quite a lot, actually. Please feel free to check out our website, or you can reach out to me directly. I'm sure Amelia can share my email address and I can get some templates to you that might be appropriate. I just wanted to wrap everything up and thank AMGC for having us involved with this great webinar. In particular, Jens and Amelia for putting everything together and just the opportunity to participate. And a sincere thank you to David Kelly for representing GIA today as well. Fantastic presentation. Even though I've been involved in David's courses before, it was great to listen in. If anything you heard today does resonate or spark something that you might want to explore a bit further, again, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have a lot going on at GIA. We've got our governance risk management forums coming up throughout May and June. They're held across the country in each state, and we'll be exploring the theme of embedding organisational resilience amidst continuous change. We've got membership available, which again provides access to lots of templates and resources on the website, but also gives discounts to events and training. And we have a suite of short courses and certificates as well, which can be delivered in-house and tailored to support an organisation rather than having staff go through the public training. So thank you for all your time today and your engagement, some great questions, and look forward to hopefully speaking to you again soon. Thanks.
Belinda, can I quickly say I'm not getting commission for books or from the GIA. I just want to say that the GIA, the Governance Institute of Australia, is, as I said at the beginning, a very fitting organization for the size of business we're dealing with. As you know, or might have seen, there be 47,000 manufacturers and 90% of them employ fewer than 20 people. So we are small to medium, and the GIA is a very good fit for that. So I highly recommend it from my very own experience, and hence I second what Belinda said. And also my thanks to David and to Belinda and everyone on the call to be available and interested in the topic. It's an important topic, and we wanted to show you that this is not a must-have and a burden, but it's an opportunity for your companies to strive. I leave it at that, unless, Amelia, you have usually the final word of the AMGC team, so over to you. And again, thank you very much.
No, I just want to thank everyone and thank David and the Governance Institute for joining us today. We have our email up here, so if there's any further questions, you can send us through an email and we'll be able to help you out. And if that's it, I think we're all good to go. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks.
See ya. Bye.